In a female chimpanzee, reproduction and life typically end together. Chimpanzees, like the overwhelming majority of animal species, continue reproducing for as long as their bodies remain alive, and they typically die not long after their reproductive capacity finally declines in old age. There is no extended period of a chimpanzee's life during which a female survives for decades after menopause. No chimpanzee equivalent of a grandmother who lives on, healthy and active, for years or decades after her own reproductive years have ended. Human beings are one of the only species on the planet in which this pattern is dramatically different. Human females typically experience menopause in their late 40s or early 50s, and yet a healthy human female can expect to live several more decades beyond that point, a post-reproductive lifespan of remarkable length that has no clear parallel in the vast majority of the animal kingdom. Only a small handful of other species, most notably certain toothed whales, including orcas and short-finned pilot whales, show anything resembling this pattern of a long, healthy, post-reproductive life. This is, from the perspective of evolutionary theory, a genuine puzzle. Natural selection operates by favoring traits that increase reproductive success, the passing on of genes to subsequent generations, a trait that causes an organism to stop reproducing decades before the end of its natural lifespan, while continuing to consume resources and occupy space within a social group, should, in a simplistic reading of evolutionary logic, be selected against rather than for. And yet human menopause, far from being a rare or unstable trait on the verge of evolutionary elimination, is a universal and highly consistent feature of human female biology, occurring at a remarkably similar age across virtually every human population that has ever been studied, regardless of diet, climate, or lifestyle. Understanding why evolution would produce and maintain such a pattern has become one of the most productive and most illuminating research programs in evolutionary anthropology. And the answer that has emerged reveals something profound about the unusual and distinctively cooperative structure of human family life. Let's begin with the theoretical framework that has done the most to resolve this puzzle. The anthropologist Kristen Hawkes at the University of Utah, whose foundational contributions to this field we touched on briefly in an earlier video in this series examining the evolution of human childhood, has spent decades developing and testing what has become known as the grandmother hypothesis, the proposal that human menopause evolved not because continued reproduction became impossible or biologically costly in some direct sense, but because older women who redirected their reproductive effort toward supporting the survival and reproductive success of their existing children and grandchildren achieved greater total genetic success than women who continued attempting to have children of their own into old age. The core logic of the grandmother hypothesis rests on a specific feature of human reproductive biology that distinguishes our species from most other primates: the extraordinarily long and metabolically expensive period of human childhood dependency that we examined in detail in an earlier video. Because human children remain nutritionally dependent on adult provisioning for many years after weaning, considerably longer than the offspring of any other great ape, a human mother faces an unusually difficult trade-off between continuing to bear additional children and adequately supporting the children she already has. Hawkes's key insight was that a grandmother, no longer burdened by the direct metabolic costs of pregnancy and nursing, but still possessing the physical strength, accumulated ecological knowledge, and social standing of an experienced adult, is uniquely positioned to help resolve this trade-off by directly provisioning her grandchildren and by supporting her own daughters through the demanding period of caring for multiple dependent children simultaneously. On this account, a woman's genes are actually served better by her ceasing her own reproduction at a certain age and redirecting that same reproductive effort toward ensuring the survival of children and grandchildren she has already produced, because grandchildren carry a substantial portion of her genetic material and because grandmotherly support measurably increases those grandchildren's chances of survival. Hawkes and her collaborators conducted extensive field research among the Hadza, a contemporary hunter-gatherer population in Tanzania, whose foraging lifestyle provides one of the closest available approximations to the ecological conditions under which human evolutionary history unfolded. This research found that grandmothers among the Hadza, particularly maternal grandmothers, spend substantial time each day foraging for food, particularly tubers and other resources that require significant strength and skill to extract, but that are not easily gathered by young children themselves, and that this grandmotherly foraging effort makes a measurable and significant contribution to the nutritional status of their grandchildren, particularly during the critical weaning period when children are nutritionally vulnerable but not yet capable of efficiently feeding themselves. The demographer Rebecca Sear at the London School of Economics has extended this research considerably by examining historical demographic records from multiple human populations, seeking direct statistical evidence for the relationship between grandmother presence and grandchild survival across a wider range of human societies than the ethnographic study of a single contemporary hunter-gatherer group can provide. Sear's research, drawing on historical birth and death records from populations including rural Gambia and various pre-industrial European populations, found a consistent and statistically robust pattern. The presence of a living maternal grandmother was associated with significantly improved survival rates for grandchildren, particularly during the vulnerable early years of childhood, across multiple distinct historical populations and cultural contexts. Sear's research also documented an important asymmetry that has become a significant focus of subsequent research. The survival benefit associated with grandmother presence was consistently stronger for maternal grandmothers than for paternal grandmothers across the populations Sear examined. This finding connects to a broader body of research on what evolutionary anthropologists call paternity uncertainty, the fact that maternal relatedness to a grandchild is always certain, since maternity is directly observable, while paternal relatedness carries an inherent, if typically small, degree of uncertainty. Because a maternal grandmother can be completely certain of her genetic relationship to her daughter's children, in a way that a paternal grandmother, whose genetic connection depends on the certainty of her own son's paternity, cannot be with quite the same confidence. Evolutionary theory predicts that maternal grandmothers should, on average, be more strongly motivated to invest in grandchildren than paternal grandmothers, a prediction that Sear's demographic research and considerable subsequent research have found broad support for. The anthropologist Cheryl Jamieson, working with a broader research consortium examining historical Japanese demographic records, found evidence supporting a related but distinct dimension of the grandmother hypothesis. Not simply that grandmothers benefit grandchildren, but that the specific timing and pattern of human menopause itself appears calibrated to maximize this grandmotherly investment. Jamieson's research, along with subsequent mathematical modeling by Hawkes and her colleagues, found that the age at which human menopause typically occurs corresponds closely to the age at which a woman's expected genetic return from continuing to bear her own children begins to fall below her expected genetic return from investing instead in existing children and grandchildren, a crossover point determined by the increasing risks of pregnancy at older maternal ages, combined with the accumulating number of existing descendants whose survival she could otherwise support. There is a further dimension of this research that deserves careful attention, because it addresses an important alternative theoretical account that has been proposed to explain human menopause. And understanding why the grandmother hypothesis has largely superseded this alternative helps clarify exactly what kind of evidence is needed to distinguish between competing evolutionary explanations for the same observed pattern. The evolutionary biologist George Williams, in an influential 1957 paper that predates the grandmother hypothesis by several decades, proposed what became known as the maternal mortality hypothesis, suggesting that menopause evolved specifically because childbirth becomes increasingly dangerous as a woman ages, such that the risk of a mother dying in childbirth, and thereby leaving her existing children without maternal care, eventually outweighs the potential benefit of having an additional child. On this account, menopause is fundamentally a protective adaptation that terminates fertility before the escalating risks of late-life pregnancy become evolutionarily counterproductive, functioning primarily to protect a woman's existing investment in children she has already born, rather than to enable a positive redirection of effort toward grandchildren specifically. The maternal mortality hypothesis and the grandmother hypothesis are not entirely mutually exclusive, and most contemporary researchers in the field regard them as complementary rather than strictly competing explanations. But they generate somewhat different predictions that have allowed researchers to evaluate their relative explanatory power. The anthropologist Virpi Lama at the University of Turku has conducted extensive research using historical Finnish demographic records, specifically designed to test predictions that distinguish between these accounts, examining whether women's postmenopausal survival and behavior is better predicted by the risks associated with continued childbearing, as the maternal mortality hypothesis would predict, or by the fitness benefits of grandmotherly investment, as the grandmother hypothesis would predict. Luma's research found substantial support specifically for the grandmother hypothesis, documenting that women who had access to a living mother-in-law, or, particularly, their own living mother during their childbearing years, showed both higher rates of subsequent reproduction themselves and better survival outcomes for their children, providing a specific mechanistic pathway, cross-generational support enabling higher fertility and child survival among the reproductive age generation, through which grandmother presence directly translates into measurable fitness benefits. Luma's research also found that the specific quantitative relationship between grandmother age and grandchild survival benefit closely tracked patterns predicted by Hawkes and Kim's mathematical models of the evolution of grandmothering, providing further quantitative support for the grandmother hypothesis specifically, rather than the maternal mortality hypothesis alone. This research has been complemented by comparative work examining the two other species with well-documented menopause and extended post-reproductive lifespan, orcas and short-finned pilot whales, providing what researchers call a natural experiment for testing whether the specific ecological and social conditions that the grandmother hypothesis identifies as necessary for the evolution of menopause are present in these independently evolved cases. The biologist Darren Croft at the University of Exeter has conducted extensive research on wild orca populations, documenting that post-reproductive female orcas play a measurably crucial leadership role within their social groups, particularly during periods of ecological scarcity, using their accumulated ecological knowledge of food source locations, built up over decades of experience, to guide their pods to productive foraging grounds in ways that measurably improve the survival of their sons and grandchildren specifically. Croft's research found that orca social groups are organized around a matrilineal structure in which both male and female offspring typically remain within their mother's social group throughout their lives, a social structure that, similarly to the human case, creates conditions in which an older female's genetic relatives remain closely and continuously associated with her throughout her extended post-reproductive lifespan, allowing her accumulated knowledge and experience to directly and repeatedly benefit her own descendants across multiple subsequent generations. The independent evolution of menopause and extended post-reproductive lifespan in orcas, under a social and ecological structure that shares this crucial feature with human societies, close and continuous association between older post-reproductive females and their genetic descendants, provides significant convergent evidence supporting the general theoretical logic of the grandmother hypothesis, even though orcas and humans are separated by tens of millions of years of independent evolutionary history and share no close common ancestor with this trait. This mathematical modeling approach has been developed extensively by the evolutionary biologist Peter Kim at the University of Utah, working closely with Hawkes, who has constructed detailed simulation models testing whether a hypothetical population in which grandmothering behavior evolves, starting from an ancestral state resembling other great apes in which females continue reproducing throughout their natural lifespan, would actually produce the specific pattern of extended post-reproductive lifespan observed in modern humans, given plausible assumptions about the survival benefits grandmothers provide and the costs associated with continued late-life reproduction. Kim and Hawkes' models found that grandmothering, once it begins even at low initial frequency within a population, tends to be strongly self-reinforcing. As more grandmothers survive and provide support, this support itself extends the average lifespan of the broader population, which in turn creates more women who survive long enough to become grandmothers themselves. A positive feedback loop that Kim and Hawkes propose can account for the evolution of both extended human post-reproductive lifespan and the broader extension of human lifespan generally, well beyond what is observed in closely related primate species. This has significant implications for understanding not just menopause specifically, but the evolution of human longevity more broadly. The anthropologist and demographer Michael Gervin at the University of California, Santa Barbara has conducted extensive comparative demographic research on hunter-gatherer and forager-horticulturalist populations, documenting that human lifespan, even in populations living under conditions that closely approximate ancestral human ecology without modern medicine, shows a distinctively human pattern. A substantial proportion of individuals who survive childhood go on to live into their 60s, 70s, and beyond, a pattern that stands in sharp contrast to the survival curves of wild chimpanzee populations, in which very few individuals survive much beyond their 40s, even under otherwise favorable ecological conditions. Gervin's research proposes that this extended human lifespan cannot be fully explained without accounting for the grandmother effect, because a lifespan extending well beyond the end of female reproductive capacity only makes evolutionary sense in a species where post-reproductive individuals continue to make substantial, fitness-relevant contributions to their surviving kin, exactly the pattern that Hawkes's grandmother hypothesis and Sears' demographic research have documented. The relationship between grandmothering and other distinctive features of human social organization has been examined by the anthropologist Sarah Blaffer-Hrdy, whose broader research on cooperative breeding we examined in the earlier video on human childhood. Hrdy has argued that grandmothers represent one crucial component of the broader system of alloparenting, cooperative childrearing involving caregivers beyond the biological mother, that Hrdy proposes was essential to the evolution of the expensive, extended human childhood in the first place. On Hrdy's account, the grandmother hypothesis and the broader cooperative breeding hypothesis are not competing explanations, but mutually reinforcing components of a single evolutionary package. Extended human childhood created selective pressure favoring any mechanism, including extended grandmother lifespan, that could help distribute the caregiving burden across a wider network of kin, and the availability of grandmother support in turn helped make the extended, expensive pattern of human childhood development evolutionarily sustainable in the first place. There is one final dimension of this research worth examining, because it addresses a question of considerable contemporary relevance. What happens to the grandmother effect in modern, industrialized societies, where the ecological and social conditions differ dramatically from the hunter-gatherer and pre-industrial agricultural contexts in which most of the classic supporting research has been conducted? The demographer Sean Fox, working with Rebecca Sear on an extended analysis of contemporary demographic data, has found that the grandmother effect, while somewhat attenuated in modern industrialized contexts where formal childcare, medical care, and economic resources are more widely available through non-familial channels, remains measurably present in contemporary populations, with grandmother involvement in childcare continuing to show positive associations with child well-being outcomes, and with measures of parental, particularly maternal, well-being and reduced parenting stress. This research suggests that the grandmother effect, though evolved under ancestral ecological conditions dramatically different from those of contemporary industrialized life, has not become vestigial or non-functional, but continues to operate as a meaningful component of family support systems, even in social contexts where its original ecological necessity has been substantially reduced by other developments including modern medicine and formalized social support systems. The psychologist and gerontologist Linda Waite at the University of Chicago has examined a complementary dimension of this question, specifically the psychological and physical health benefits that grandparenting itself appears to confer on the grandparents, documenting that active involvement in grandchild care is associated with better self-reported health, reduced rates of depression, and in some studies, measurably improved cognitive functioning among grandparents themselves, particularly grandmothers, compared to demographically similar individuals with less involvement in grandchild care. This finding suggests that the evolved psychological and social system underlying human grandmothering may not simply provide unilateral benefits flowing from grandmother to grandchild, but may instead constitute a genuinely reciprocal relationship in which the psychological rewards of the grandmothering role itself, likely reflecting the same evolved motivational and emotional systems that made grandmothering adaptive in the ancestral environment in the first place, continue to provide meaningful benefits to grandmothers in contemporary societies that have moved far beyond the specific ecological pressures under which those systems originally evolved. This body of research collectively suggests that the grandmother hypothesis describes not simply a historical explanation for why human menopause evolved, but an ongoing and actively functioning system, one whose underlying psychological and behavioral machinery continues to shape family relationships, child development outcomes, and the well-being of older women themselves, millions of years removed from the specific hunter-gatherer ecology under which grandmothering behavior first proved evolutionarily advantageous, and that continues to operate with measurable effect even within the radically different social and technological context of contemporary human life. What emerges from this substantial body of research is a picture of human female longevity, and the distinctive pattern of extended post-reproductive life that culminates in the social role of grandmother, not as an evolutionary anomaly or accident, but as a specific and well-documented adaptation, one that reveals something fundamental about the unusually cooperative structure of human reproduction and child-rearing compared to virtually every other species on the planet. Human children are so expensive to raise, and human childhood is so extended that the species could not have evolved its characteristic pattern of development without also evolving a mechanism for distributing the resulting caregiving burden across multiple generations simultaneously present within a single family and community. The grandmother sitting with her grandchildren, teaching them skills, providing food, offering the kind of steady presence that a busy young mother, juggling multiple dependent children, cannot always provide alone, is not a sentimental afterthought to the story of human evolution. She is one of the specific mechanisms through which that evolution became possible in the first place. The extraordinarily long human childhood that gave rise to language, culture, and the accumulated knowledge that makes human societies what they are, could not have evolved without someone available to help carry its cost. Evolution's answer, unique among almost all animals on this planet, was to keep grandmothers alive, healthy, and present for decades after their own reproductive story had already reached its natural end.
Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next video. If you find this video interesting, please consider subscribing for more content like this.